Hello and welcome back to Switch and Lever. In this world we live in, there are few constants. Water is wet, Christopher Walken is the best actor who ever lived, and cats will shed like they were paid in catnip to do so. I'm betting we could do something more useful with all of that hair though. I'm betting we could even turn it into a knife handle. Once you're done chasing around cats and gathering up a decent amount of feline leftovers, you're ready to move on to preparing the rest of the pieces you need. Obviously, unless you're planning on making the knife blade yourself, get a suitable one from a blade retailer. This is a small Mora whittling blade made from high quality Swedish steel. I started with making a mock-up of the knife handle from soft modeling foam, just to get a feel for how it sits in the hand, proportions with the blade, and of course how much material I was going to need. As you may already have guessed, we're going to cast the cat hair into clear epoxy, and for that we need a container to cast in. I built one from some scrap pieces of clear acrylic and superglue, which fits the mock-up handle I made with a little room to spare. If you want the whole handle made from epoxy, you can skip the next few steps, but I felt like making it a little bit more interesting. I took some mahogany and cut it into slices. The slices were flattened and squared up on a disc sander before being glued together with an offset from each other to create a staggered shape. Both superglue and wood glue is used, as the superglue will bite directly and essentially hold the pieces together as the wood glue dries. Clamp it up once it's all together and leave it to dry. Then we're essentially just repeating this process again, slicing it up, squaring it up, and gluing it together again to create a block of staggered square pegs. Once the glue dried the second time, it's cut down to size and fine-tuned on the disc sander again to fit perfectly into the container we'll be using for casting. And yes, doing what I'm doing is all kinds of experimental. Basically all I did was mix up epoxy, making sure to stir the resin well, and then I just dumped in the cat hair, creating something that wouldn't look too out of place being fished out of a shower drain. The container to hold the epoxy had been secured against a thin fiber board and sealed using an off-brand blue tack to make sure it wouldn't leak during the casting. I'm using a long set epoxy to give a good working time and hopefully allow as many air bubbles as possible to escape the cast. Give your cast ample time to cure. I think I left mine for 3 days before extracting it from the mold. There really wasn't much to it. Just cut off the acrylic container and sand it down to raw epoxy. Using the handle mock-up and the knife blade, the epoxy block was then marked with the general shape of the handle, as well as how deep and wide the hole for the knife tang need to be drilled. Here is where things started to go astray though. I could kind of feel it when I was working with the epoxy before, but it became very apparent when drilling. The epoxy was just too soft. Either I messed up the ratios of resin and hardener, or I didn't mix it well enough, the amount of cat hair softened the resin, or the epoxy was too old or had other issues. Either way, it's back to the drawing board, as this handle blank is simply unusable for further work. In a way though, that was just as well, as I was a bit unhappy with the amount of cat hair I used. I felt like the block was too opaque, so after going through all the same steps in the beginning to create the acrylic container and the staggered wood block, I went to cast it once again. This time I used another brand of epoxy resin, as well as much less cat hair to give the blank a more transparent look. In the end, the blank looks just fabulous. Ask anyone. Just the best. Everyone says so. After a bit of a trim, I'm really digging how this came out. Going with less cat hair was definitely a better way to go. It's both transparent and translucent, with the individual strands proudly visible. Now again it's the same procedure as before, and we're back to drilling out the hole for the tang of the blade. I'm doing the majority of it on the drill press to get a nice straight hole. This was then fine-tuned with a hand drill and with smaller files to create a snug fit for the tang. As you may have realized, the tang was shortened down as well to not reach through the entire handle. While doing this, it's also a good idea to notch it a little bit with the hacksaw, so it has a better grip when glued into the handle. After the drilling, I gave it a rough shaping on the bandsaw and belt sander to minimize the work I had to do after the blade was fitted in the handle. I'm creating a small bolster from a piece of brass plate, milled and then filed with a reasonably tight-fitting slot for the tang. Getting ready for gluing, it's really a good idea to mask off anything you don't want to get glue on, such as the entirety of the exposed blade as well as the front of the bolster. I also made a small wooden piece to go in between the bolster and the cat hair resin, simply because I thought it would look better. For this glue up I used a slow set epoxy glue. It cures in about 30 minutes or so, as opposed to most epoxy glues which cure in more like 5 minutes. This gives a little bit more working time, which is good if you have several pieces going together. No stress leads to less mistakes. Well, at least that's the idea. The hole for the tang was filled up well with epoxy to minimize the amount of air bubbles and to ensure a good strong bond for the tang. From here on, once the glue has dried, it's mostly just traditional handle shaping. I'm going at it with belt and disc sanders to carefully and coarsely get it into shape. Then continued shaping it with progressively finer files and sandpaper until I was happy with how it looked and felt in my hand. I realize it still looks a bit boring. The epoxy even looks a bit cloudy, despite being sanded up to 600 grit. I didn't really want to polish it, simply because I didn't know what that would do to the wood. The epoxy only looks cloudy though because of all the surface scratches from the sandpaper, and the easiest way to fill those in and give the rest of the handle a nice shine is with some clear varnish. The blade was masked off again and the handle given a couple of coats of some high gloss automotive spray varnish I had laying around from another project. You can see the immediate transformation from cloudy to clear as the varnish hits the handle. And that's really it. Once the varnish is dried, the knife is done. Quite frankly, I couldn't be happier. It's a fun little knife and it's sharp as can be. It fits well in my hand and it's just lovely to carve with. The tang of the blade is visible through the epoxy, but I don't think that detracts too much from its look. It can't be denied that it has a coolness factor to it that puts it into a class of its own. Whether that's a better or worse class than anything else is definitely still up for debate. Do you have any cool ideas for projects made from cat hair? Leave a comment below the video. Otherwise, check out what else is on offer from Switch and Lever. There's a wealth of information on this channel as well as over on Instagram. Like, subscribe, pet your cat, you know the drill. Thank you for watching and until next time!